welcome you all on behalf of the Society of Fellows Heyman Center and the Institute of Social and Economic Research and Policy here at Columbia University to this discussion of the recently published book by Mahmood Mamdani, Neither Settler nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, recently published, in fact, only very, very recently published by Harvard University Press. So what I'm going to do is to introduce all the panelists, and then I will give you a sense of how we will proceed, and then I will simply let it go. So to begin with, we have a panel of 4 speakers. Mahmood Mamdani, Nadia Abu El-Haj, Mamadou Diouf, and Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. And I will introduce them. And after each speaker, I will tell you who the next one, I'll remind you who the next one will be, but they will speak in this order. To begin with, Mahmood Mamdani is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government in the School of International Public Affairs and Professor in the Departments of Anthropology, Political Science, and MISAS here at Columbia. He's also the director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research, and I believe also recently appointed, if I'm not mistaken, as Chancellor of Kampala International University. His works explore the intersection between politics and culture, a comparative study of colonialism since 1452, the history of civil war and genocide in Africa, the Cold War and the War on Terror, and the history and theory of human rights. Prior to joining the Columbia faculty, Professor Mamdani was at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania between 1973 and 1979, Makerere University in Uganda between 1980 and 1993, the University of Cape Town and the University of Cape Town between 1996 and 1999. He has received numerous awards and recognitions. From 1998 to 2002, he served as the president of the Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa, CODESRIA. He is the author of many books, too numerous to mention, but I will mention 2 of them: Citizen and Subject, and Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, as well as, of course, the book that we are here to discuss today. His essays have appeared in the New Left Review and the London Review of Books. Nadia Abu El-Haj is the Anne Whitney Olin Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Barnard and Columbia, the co-director of the Center for Palestine Studies here at Columbia, and chair of the board of directors of the Society of Fellows Heyman Center for the Humanities. She too is the recipient of numerous awards, including from the Social Science Research Council, the Wenner-Gren Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Harvard Academy for Area and International Studies, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and others. She's the author of many journal articles across a range of topics, from the history of archaeology in Palestine to the question of race and genomics today. She's the author of 2 books, Facts on the Ground, Archaeological Practice and Territorial Self-Fashioning in Israeli Society, which won the Albert Hourani Annual Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association in 2002, and the author of The Genealogical Science, The Search for Jewish Origins and the Politics of Epistemology. While these 2 books have focused on historical science, her 3rd book, tentatively titled Soldier Trauma, The Obligations of Citizenship and the Forever Wars, which is forthcoming. This book examines the field of military psychiatry and explores the complex ethical and political implications of shifting psychiatric and public understandings of the trauma of American soldiers. Then we will have Mamadou Diouf, who is the Leitner Family Professor of African Studies and the Director of the Columbia University's Institute for African Studies. He holds a PhD from the University of Paris Sorbonne before joining the faculty at Columbia. He was a Charles D. Moody Junior Collegiate Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Michigan. And before that, head of the Research, Information, and Documentation Department at Cadastria. And at the same time, a faculty member in the History Department of Cheikh Anta Diop, University of Dakar, Senegal. His research interests include urban, political, social, and intellectual history in colonial and post-colonial Africa. And his publications include Tolerance, Democracy, and Sufis in Senegal in 2013, and New Perspectives on Islam in Senegal, Conversion, Migration, Wealth, and Power. And Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who I think of as our very special guest, is a historian, author, memoirist, and speaker who researches Western Hemisphere history and international human rights. She grew up in rural Oklahoma, the daughter of a tenant farmer and part Indian mother. She has been active in the international indigenous movement for more than 4 decades, and she is known for her lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues. After receiving her PhD in history at the University of California, Los Angeles, she taught in the newly established Native American Studies program at California State University in Hayward, and helped found the departments of Ethnic Studies and Women's Studies. She too is the author of many books, but perhaps the one most pertinent to this occasion is the very well-known An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, published in 2014, and which won the 2015 American Book Award. So our speakers will speak in this order: Mahmood Mamdani, then Nadia Abu El-Haj, Mamadou Diouf, and Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Each of the speakers will speak for 10 minutes, roughly, give or take. Professor Mamdani will have an opportunity to respond to the panel's comments and discussion for, give or take, 5 minutes. And the panel will then have an opportunity to ask Professor Mamdani questions, and then we will open it up to the questions from the audience. So with that, Mahmoud, shall I hand it over to you?
Thank you, David. This is a book about the nation state and about post-colonial modernity. I trace the beginnings of the nation state to Iberia in 1492 under the slogan, "One country, one religion, one empire, they cleansed the nation," setting fire to majority-minority relations within the polity. It is in this context that John Locke's treatise on tolerance put forward a liberal solution. Catholics can be tolerated if they renounce any political support of the Pope or of any power outside England. Locke's thesis informed the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. Inscribed in the treaty were 2 key components of the modern state: religious toleration at home and the reciprocal guarantee of sovereignty abroad. The liberal notion of the nation state turned majorities and minorities into permanent political identities. Only the majority can be sovereign. The minority must not participate in sovereignty. This was the original sin. This is also a book about history, about racial domination and colonial subjugation as 2 political strategies to deal with the minority question. I begin with the United States as a founding experience in modern colonialism, and the reservation as the site where core institutions of modern colonialism were forged. This is also a book about extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation state building in the post colonies. It asks two big questions. One, should we think of extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation state building? Should we think of extreme violence in the Nuremberg mold as a criminal project or as a political project? A notion implicit in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Two, what is transportable in the South African experience? What does South Africa have to teach the world? I'll begin with the American reservation. What's in a name? How should we call the pre-Columbian resident communities of the Americas? As Indian or as native? What is at stake? What difference would it make if the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. is called the National Museum of the Native American? Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations, so that a separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968? The difference between the two is telling. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, whereas the 1968 Indian Act is only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and have never been rights-bearing citizens of the United States in a constitutional sense. There were no reservations before the United States. The reservation was a creation of the United States. The reservation is a separate polity, separate from the United States. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants, they were settlers. What is the difference? Whether they seek equality or advantage, immigrants come to join existing polities. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the United States. In the words of Chief Justice John Marshall, reservations are, quote, domestic dependent colonies. Reservation Indians are legally wards of Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any indirect rule colony in Africa, including where I grew up, Uganda. This colonial reality is masked by the term Indian tribal sovereignty. The Indian reservation was part of a two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate. It was Lincoln's late 19th century contribution to the search for a permanent solution to how to govern Indians who had survived the genocide. Colonized Indians and African slaves represent two different solutions to the minority question, each with a radically different set of consequences. Racial and colonial domination are not the same, even if or when racial discrimination is common to both. Economically, the American Indian symbolized stolen land. The African slave embodied captive and coerced labor. Politically, Indians were governed in a protectorate as part of a two-state solution. African slaves were racially segregated within a one-state polity. The one-state solution provided a political frame for a struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination. The two-state solution explains the continued fragmentation, isolation, and colonial subjugation of the reservation Indian. Different aspects of the American model were exported to different places. Among these, South Africa, Germany, and Israel. I'll say a few things about two of them. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. A delegation visited North America 2 years later to study how Indians were governed. Key elements of governance were imported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. Every tribe must be territorially contained in a homeland. Every homeland must be administered by a homeland authority, sanctioned as traditional, and thus not subject to being elected. This traditional authority must enforce a customary law in the homeland, with one proviso, that custom be purged of all practices or notions that settlers considered repugnant to civilization. The American reservation became the South African reserve. If Americans remain settlers, what about the Jewish people in Israel? I argue that the Jewish population of Mandate Palestine belonged to three groups. Those who had never left Palestine were part of the natives of Palestine. Those who had returned during the Mandate seeking a religious homeland, they were content to be part of the existing polity. These are the immigrants of the first aliyah. I consider them immigrants, not settlers. But those who came in the second and the third aliyah, who wanted their own exclusive polity, a Jewish nation state in place of the existing polity, these need to be defined as settlers. Victims of the nation state project in Germany and in Europe, Zionists decided to set up a nation state in Eretz Israel. This project required, one, reducing Palestinians to a numeric minority within Eretz Israel. Two, ensuring that the Palestinians inside Israel do not participate in sovereignty. They may have rights, including the right to vote, but they will not participate in power. This vision is clearest in the notion that official Israel changed its vision from being a Jewish and democratic state to being an exclusively Jewish state. The anti-Zionist debate on the way forward focuses on the form of the state. A one-state solution would be akin, the debate is about one state or two state. A one-state solution would be akin to direct racial domination. A two-state solution would represent indirect Zionist colonization through the creation of a protectorate. In American terms, these alternates are represented by the African slave and the colonized Indian. For a third alternative, we have to look to the South African transition from apartheid. David, please feel free to tell me when time is up, okay? Oh, you are muted, sorry, I'll go on.
About a minute and a half, Mahmoud.
Okay, thank you. Before 1970, anti-apartheid politics before 1970, anti-apartheid politics in South Africa reproduced the architecture of apartheid. Each racial group organized separately, as defined by apartheid power. Africans as African National Congress, Indians as Natal Indian Congress, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, and whites as Congress of Democrats. The apartheid mold was broken in the 1970s. The key initiative came from the student movement, white and black. Black students under Biko left the liberal white students organization, formed their own separate body, and went on to organize township dwellers, starting with Soweto. Meanwhile, radical white students left in the wilderness turned to organizing hostile workers on the fringes of townships. This radical move crossed race lines. It was a move that would prove to be of historical significance. Out of this experience was born an epistemological awakening. Political identity is historical, not natural. When speaking of Black consciousness, Biko explained, Black is not a color. If you're oppressed, you're Black. Afrikaners made a historic journey from being junior partners of British colonialism to joining the anti-apartheid coalition. I'll stop here because the discussion is ongoing and my notes haven't finished. Thank you, David.
Thank you very, very much, Mahmoud. So we will begin with the discussion of Mahmoud's book and start with Nadia Abu El-Haj. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm still bad at this. Thank you, and Mahmoud, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's an honor to comment on this book, so I will just begin. I'm also going to set my own timer. Okay, Neither Settler Nor Native is an ambitious book, as committed to historical rereading of the birth of political modernity as it is to, quote, decolonizing the political, unquote, that is, to articulating a political otherwise for the future. Its starting point is the incisive suggestion that rather than reading the birth of the modern state, dating the birth of the modern state to the Treaty of Westphalia signed in 1648, we look instead to 1492, when the twin events of the ethnic cleansing of the Iberian Peninsula and the taking of overseas colonies in the Americas began. I quote, "The birth of the modern state amid ethnic cleansing and overseas domination teaches us a different lesson about what political modernity is, less an engine of tolerance than of conquest," unquote. As the book unfolds, going back to 1492 enables Mahmoud to make the US a central, for that matter, an originary model of and for not just the modern nation state, but also for the excessive violence of political modernity more generally. In short, Pache Aimé Césaire and Hannah Arendt, it was not European colonial projects in Africa and Asia that boomeranged back to Europe with the rise of Nazism. There was a prior history. The US was its central model. In particular, it's dealing with the Indian question and the history of reservations in the US. So too was US settler nationhood, a model for apartheid South Africa and for the Zionist state. So in my remarks today, I will pull on but a few threads of this very rich book. First, I'll consider Mahmoud's analysis of Palestine and Israel. Second, I will think about the concept of the survivor that appears in the book as a route to decolonizing the political and forging a different collective political future. And finally, I raise some questions about the vision, Mahmoud's vision of the political in which the state is severed from the nation. So let me begin with the first. The book's reading of the history of Zionism heeds pretty closely to what has become a widely accepted historical discourse, whether on the part of the Palestinian scholars or on the part of the so-called new historians, that is, Israeli scholars often self-described as post-Zionist, who gained access to the Israeli state archives in 1979, the archives on the 48 war, and who wrote a new history of their state. Yes, there remain deep disagreements over whether or not the expulsion of Palestinians in 1948, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, was pre-planned or a result of the fog and unpredictability of war. But that Palestinians were expelled is no longer a topic of serious scholarly debate. One might even say, by and large, it is accepted as fact by the Israeli public at large. What might that new historiography then tell us about the ways in which, as settler nations, the autobiographies of the US and Israel, I'm using the term autobiography and borrowing from Mahmoud, not just overlap, but also diverge? Neither settlers nor native proposes an interesting and generative distinction between what it might mean to imagine oneself as an immigrant versus what it means to imagine oneself or admit to being a settler. The immigrant seeks to join an existing polity, whereas the settler seeks to establish a new one, to establish sovereignty over it and to assure its majority rule. Mahmoud writes, quote, "The conflation of settlers and immigrants is essential to the settler colonial nation state projects such as the United States and Israel. The political project of the settler to create and fortify the colonial nation state becomes obscured by the non-political project of the immigrant, who merely seeks to take advantage of what the state allows every citizen," unquote. Indeed, describing US society as a society of immigrants is not just an act of depoliticization. It's a way of erasing the fact of the US as a settler colonial project altogether, as this book suggests and documents. And I would want to add that move is also crucially key to erasing the history of slavery. Not all non-Native Americans are immigrants, after all. But I'm not sure the argument about conflating the settler with the immigrant and its non-politicization extends as seamlessly to Israel. Zionism is a very particular iteration of settler nationhood, after all. It's a concept of return. The concept of the immigrant, in other words, is quite distinct from the concept of the Oleh, the Jew who returns to Israel. He who not just returns, but in fact ascends, which is the meaning of Aliyah. Aliyah is never masked, in other words, as an apolitical project. And the Jew who makes Aliyah is not described as an immigrant, but an Oleh. And it is decidedly political, even if whether or not it is a colonial project is a matter of dispute. Perhaps there is no non-political Jewish immigrant here. Moreover, I want to suggest if the American nation state project has gone further and further towards erasing its settler origins, the Israeli one seems to be more and more comfortable with embracing it. The settler origins, that is. I can't elaborate here, but I've thought about this elsewhere. For decades after the War of 48, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine was denied, cast as a lie. But beginning in 1979 with the opening of the archives, and now by the turn of the millennium, a new configuration of knowledge, power, and settler nationhood has found form. Israeli settler nationhood no longer depends on the suppression of the truth of 48. Instead, it operates through the embrace of a far more brazen and explicit seizure of power and knowledge. Perhaps the father figure of the so-called new historians, Benny Morris, puts it most clearly. All nations are founded in violence. Israel is no exception. It had to be done, he declared around 2000. Ben-Gurion should have finished the job. Or as another liberal establishment figure put it, the choice is either living with Lidda, a city in central Palestine in which Palestinians were massacred and the rest expelled, a necessity if the Jewish majority state was to be established, which is his argument. The choice is either living with that or rejecting Zionism. And as he writes, this is Ari Shavit, he chooses to, quote, stand by the damned, unquote. In other words, yes, the Nakba, yes, the history of settlement, and no, we Israelis don't care. Okay, I'm going to move now to think about the concept of the survivor. And I'm clearly over time, so I'm going to skip a bit. Neither settler nor native proposes the survivor as an alternative way of organizing the political in the aftermath of the colonial or en route to the decolonization of the political. As a concept, a category, it is to supplant the identity categories that, while politically and historically produced, are assumed to be natural and unchangeable, and particularly in the nation-state form. The Jew, the Arab, the nation, the native, the settler, the tribe, majority, the minority, for that matter, the victim and perpetrator. I quote, the people of today can, through concerted engagement with the facts of political modernity, be convinced of the necessity of discarding its divisive identities. We can all learn to see ourselves as survivors of political modernity, created by it, but not doomed to repeat it. Survivors do not necessarily agree on what the shape of society and the affordances of the state should be, but survivors are at least not configured from the start as enemies in a zero-sum contest for power, unquote. Yes, as scholarship has argued for decades now, identities long taken for granted as given, national, ethnic, racial, are in fact historically constructed. Neither settler nor native sets out not only to make that eminently clear, but also to issue an urgent call for a politics that moves beyond its dangerous effects. That transformation is what stands at the heart of decolonizing politics. I am curious, however, about the choice of survivor as the productive, a liberating alternative. The concept of survivor is rooted in the same history that the book decries, the struggle to come to terms with the Second World War, and to do so initially at least, through juridical means. If the Holocaust was not available as a category and concept during the Nuremberg trials, as Mahmoud shows, that was to change over the next few decades, and the concept of survivor was born on that very same terrain. Psychiatrists such as Henry Crystal and William Niederland developed the concept of survivor guilt while treating former concentration camp inmates, out of which the more general notion of the survivor emerged. And their work was not merely clinical, it was also forensic. How could they best frame the trauma of those who had lived through the concentration camp experience in such a way as to make them eligible for compensation from German courts? Over time, the survivor became a way of naming not only those who had suffered what Crystal referred to as massive psychic trauma, Hiroshima, and for Robert J. Lifton, the Holocaust in Nagasaki, but other kinds of violent events, rape and incest quite centrally. The survivor is a victim, but not merely a victim. Over time, as a category and concept, the survivor has come to operate very much as an identity claim, one grounded in a state of injury, to borrow Wendy Brown's term, that is definitional of the self. The concept of survivor then strikes me as having many of the same problems, or at least potentially having many of the same problems of naturalization that Mahmoud seeks to unpack and take apart for other forms of identity and classification. Moreover, in calling everyone survivors, do we not flatten out the problem of privilege, culpability, and responsibility in ways that might harbor its own set of political and moral problems? Does it make any sense for everyone in Israel-Palestine, for all Israeli Jews to be, quote, counted as Zionism survivors, unquote? I'm not so sure I want to ascribe responsibility solely to institutions, where Mahmoud writes, the concept of survivor rightfully places it. I may well be far more on Hannah Arendt's side. In my reading of Eichmann in Jerusalem, at least, she recognizes violence as both criminal and political, to use Mahmoud's distinction. The latter, the political, does not diminish the problem of individual responsibility, sometimes political, and at other times, and in Eichmann's case, also critical. Okay, I just have them very short to read. Finally, I want to ask for more elaboration on the vision of a democratic state without severed from the nation or severed from culture as imagined in this book. To be clear, I'm not defending either the nation state form or the organization of states around majority and minority distinctions. But upon finishing the book, I'm left wondering how this vision differs from a classically liberal one. I quote, replacing the nation state with a mere state, a legal sovereign with equal treatment of citizens, does not mean there is no more diversity in the world. It means that diversity is no longer politicized, unquote. On the one hand, I read and hear, I hear an echo of an Arendtian understanding of the political. The idea that the majority should be constituted not a priori, as in fact of a state founded for the nation. Rather, the majority appears or should appear, and I quote, as an outcome of the political process and not its unchanging starting and ending point, unquote. But at one and the same time, I wonder, what does diversity that is, quote, no longer politicized, unquote, mean in practice? How or where does it operate or appear legitimately? What does it mean that its home is society and not the state, as the book argues? And what effects or significance might diversity then have? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Nadia. That was very illuminating. And now we turn over to Mamadou Diouf.
Thank you. I would like to thank Mahmoud for associating me to this discussion about a very, very rich book. And when I finished reading it and preparing my comments, my first question was about the nature of this book. And, not only the scholarship, but also the politics behind. And, my inclination was to say, okay, it is an analytical history book. I know Mahmoud's relation with history. It's a way of trying to find out a kind of intellectual arc which will enable him to explain very specific situations. And I'm using situation in a kind of Sartrean way. It's the kind of deep meaning of a space, of relation, and of ideas. But the second element, which seems to me interesting, is Mahmoud himself is claiming to be part of a long tradition of political theory, which has been obsessed by the objective of violence, which are political rather than criminal. And the way in which throughout the book, rather than is appearing, shows that actually the perspective adopted by Mahmoud is a perspective of paying attention to dichotomies, showing contrasts and the importance of that was contrasted. And his approaches both historical, political, in the double sense of his discipline of political scientist, but also as somebody interested in politics is very interesting. And the centrality of politics in relation to human rights, to criminal justice, and to rethinking what he called the political order in which justice is pursued is I think, very important, because it sets his goal, the goal he set for himself in his book, to think the creation of a more inclusive political community, which is able to deal with the two key elements producing violence, which are the layers of exclusion, race, ethnicity, religion, in particular communities which are against actually the nation state foundation, the permanent definition of majority and minority. And what he's trying to do is precisely to displace by tracing the history, the combination of neoliberal and human rights ideology. So as I say, it's a book which is about binary, and the title already shows it. Neither settler nor native. It examines the emergence and scope of political violence. I'm not going to repeat what Nadia say about the importance, the critical importance of the US colonial model and the treatment of the US as a colonial and after post-colonial is very important, because it basically allows Mahmoud to ask the basic question, which is structuring his book, how the construction and maintenance of a nation state, a project born, out of political modernity and relying and fostering violence, has been so central in our life for so long. And what is the solution to this issue, which what he called, decolonization? I will come back to that, because the aspect which has been really more important for me is Mahmoud's invitation to imagine political community beyond the nation state, which is how do we imagine what he called, quote unquote, a hopeful future outside the US colonial model, outside the two Sudan solution, learning lesson from Nuremberg and the TRC, but also learning lesson which Nadia has discussed, looking at Palestine and Israel. So the book is basically about what I call the crushing tyrannies of the modern state, born in 1492. I will come back to that, because my comments will be about dating the origin of the nation state and which actually state could be considered as the origin in Europe, and the discussion among historians and people, the group of people who are called the modernists. And Mahmoud is a little bit part of it, though he is situating himself before, and the group which historians are calling the medievalists, which are seeing actually the nation state in almost the 10th century. But I will, but the interesting aspect, in Mahmoud's discussion is his interest in the structure of ideas, their genealogy, their implication and ramification in the longue durée, and the way that he connects. And I will borrow Walter Mignolo's title. He connects global design with local histories. And the exercise of historical connection, I think, without claiming to be, a connecting historian, is something quite interesting. And it raises the question of how do we imagine? How do we imagine the future? And I think that Mahmoud does a great job, in his research account, fusing the general and the particular, the abstract and the concrete, engaging political, cultural, but also academic issue, questioning in particular the shaping and circulation of political imagination and concept. So he does a wonderful job addressing the epistemic regime and infrastructure to trace that continuous arc from the civilizing mission to the post-colonial nation state. He also addresses the issue of indirect and post-colonial rule to explore the extreme and destructive presence of violence, what he called a common premise shared by the colonial and the anti-colonial. And he in particular insists on the persistence of political modernity, raising two critical questions. Why is building the nation after colonialism presume homogenizing and subjugating society? Why is it so difficult to decolonize the political? Of course, for a historian, one of the first discussion which has been the discussion between Mahmoud and historian is his understanding of what he called the legacy of colonialism. You know, a kind of approach which is more general than the historians would like, because historians are, it seems, always nuancing and distorting things according to one of my colleagues. But what I'm mostly interested in is his showing of these two moments of the early colonial period and what he called the shift from, which will be very complicated, from the civilizing mission to indirect rule. So we have a sense of what indirect rule is. But one thing he's adding is, I think, what he called the mediation, which are the mediation of indirect rule. And because his territory is so large, he's able to look at indirect rule as an individual process in the Roman Empire to its institutionalization in the Ottoman Empire and its territorialization, what he considered an invention of the American. And the issue of land is why the issue of land is so central, because the American model is a model which actually focuses on land and on displacing population. It's not only about reservation, but it's also about displacing the narrative. And the comparison he makes, looking also at denazification in Eastern Europe and the move of the German population from Eastern and Central Europe to Germany, is something which is interesting to take into account. But basically the issue I have is the issue of the civilizing mission and his closure at a given moment. I don't think, in particular from the empire I know better, which is the French Empire, is that the scholarship has shown that is the tension between precisely two understanding of the tension empire, which has created many crises within the governance system. On one hand, you had the missionaries, which have been the largest group of white people in West Africa in particular, and the colonial administration. The church, the Catholic Church in particular, advocating for conversion and radical assimilation, and the administration resisting that, and as Mahmoud insists on, basically insisting on maintaining customs and governing Africans on a customary basis. And I think it's important to look at the way in which the colonial order and its system, what Mudimbe calls the colonizing structure, of function, colonizing structure with its three elements, which is territorial conquest, incorporation of the colonial economy in the metropolitan economy, and what he called the reformation of the colonized mind. I think that it should be interesting to have Mahmoud reacting to that and how it could affect his discussion. The second question I'm really interested in, and his discussion of denazification, to show how the nation state became so central, and the fact that it was adopted, because one thing he shows very nicely is how denazification has played a role in creating ethnically homogeneous nation and redefining the normal quote-unquote nation state in Europe, and saying that it has been something which was adopted by the post-colonial elite in Africa. My question is, don't you think that it was more complicated than that? They did not agree. And I can give two examples we have discussed a little bit. The first example is Senghor, the first president of Senegal, who coined after World War II this concept, which is the concept of balkanization. And balkanization is precisely signaling that he understood very well what denazification meant. But at the same time, he was against the model for Africa because he wanted to maintain federation. And what Senghor actually advocated was that the idea of a nation as it emerged in Europe was completely irrelevant to Africa, because Africa had another, what he called another history. And his prime minister, who explained it better, published in 1960 a book, which is called, translated in English, The African Nations and World Solidarity, in which he is pushing against the nation state as a European, the product of European history. But he was also pushing against, and this is important in Mahmoud's approach, against the knowledge produced under colonialism. He was asking for the production of the new knowledge. And it's interesting to contrast the leadership of the 1950s, Senghor, Mamadou Diouf, to a leader of the 1980s, Samora Machel. The sentence the quote you give, for the nation to live, the tribe must die. I think that, I think it's a thing which is, so I know that I have no longer time, but I will conclude very quickly to say that I was also, I will not be able to discuss the nation, but this could be interesting. In particular, I read Mahmoud's book and went back to read a book I read a long time ago by Adrian Hastings, The Construction of Nationhood, Ethnicity, Religion, and Nationalism. Hastings is interesting because he's a priest who had been the founder of the Journal of African Religion, and the importance of religion in this discussion about nationhood. But about how to imagine a hopeful tomorrow, how to decolonize the political community. I think that I would like to hear more, in particular, the possibility, which is today a discussion, at least in West Africa. How do you go beyond the nation state? How do you go back to the way in which polities were created? Polities which were not based on ethnicity, but it was basically based on what archaeologists are calling clustering, the clustering of communities, and the creation of a space which is not necessarily a space of citizenship in one polity, but space of multiple citizenship, which is the problem which is actually in the South African case very central, but which Mahmoud does not elaborate at the end, the very question of pluralism. So thank you.
Mamadou, forgive me, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up. Is that, you're done?
I'm done, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mamadou. Very, very illuminating. And so we turn to our final panelist, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Well, it's good to be here with colleagues at Columbia from distant San Francisco. I've been following Mahmood Mamdani's work on settler colonialism since his 2012 Edward Said Memorial Lecture at Princeton, which was specifically on the United States as a settler colonial state. It was the first time I'd heard that analysis from Africa since the 1960s in graduate school discussions with my colleagues, South African exiles, Martin Lagassic and Pablo Jordan. We didn't really use that term, but they kept saying the United States was very much like South Africa. And that was my first incipient understanding of settler colonialism. So Africa always has much to teach us. Knowing Mamdani's previous work on Darfur and genocide, it meant a lot to me, that lecture in 2012. Now we have this welcome masterwork, neither settler nor native, a comparative study that includes a profound analysis of the United States as the first settler colonial state and of the colonial nature of Native peoples in the United States. Since US intellectuals, politicians, and liberals in general, as well as the rest of the world, view the United States as a nation of immigrants and a democracy, it's worth repeating Mamdani's clarification of the difference between an immigrant and a settler. He writes in the book that immigrants join existing polities, whereas settlers create new ones. And if Europeans in the United States were immigrants, they would have joined the existing societies in the New World. Instead, they destroyed those societies and built a new one that was reinforced by later waves of settlement. Mamdani understands that this conflation of immigrant and settler is essential to the settler colonial states like US and Israel in order to obscure the colonial nation state in actuality, to obscure it. What is being obscured in the United States? Genocide, ethnic cleansing, official racism, and concentration camps, as Mamdani says. The Nazis borrowed this and implemented it, and certainly it was copied in the founding of South Africa and Israel, culminating in the National Party's apartheid regime, which was probably the most thorough settler colonial state for a short time in history, although very much copied from the US model. The insightful first chapter of the book is titled The Indian Question in the United States. That that just thrilled me, that very title. And this is what I will focus on speaking about today. Mamdani points out that the United States is not the world's only colonial state, but it is unique in its failure to recognize itself in the mirror. He argues that what is required is a new mirror, a new narrative, which he provides in a brilliant 69-page capsule, Deep History. I'm pleased that he chose to use my book, An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, as one of his guides to this construction of a new mirror. Mamdani deftly navigates the history of the arcane federal colonial administrative system and laws that constitute the US state, that developed from genocidal wars to the reservation system under military control, to dictatorial bureaucratic control of the reservations, to the 1924 federal citizenship that Native people didn't ask for, and with the 1930s reforms, implementation of colonial indirect rule. With the federal government, the final arbiter, and US Congress, the source of funding. The reform state of affairs did not last very long, though, and what followed during the Cold War 1950s was an abrupt reversal to legislation to terminate Indian status as such and to dissolve the remaining Indian land base, the reservations. After devastating terminations over a period of 2 decades, the 1960s Red Power movement of land occupations led to a reversal of termination and the return to the reform status where it remains pretty much unchanged today. There was some rhetoric in the Nixon era Self-Determination Act, such as self-determination and nation to nation, but it was basically the same as the 1930s reforms. As an aside, the US State Department of the Interior, which houses the Bureau of Indian Affairs, is being, there's now a lobbying effort by progressives to persuade President-elect Joe Biden to appoint a Native member of Congress from New Mexico, Deb Haaland, as Secretary of the Interior. It sounds good, but I agree with Mamdani that, who argues convincingly that such reform measures and the introduction of Native personnel do not contribute to the decolonization of the United States because they remain firmly within the colonial national narrative. The richness of Mamdani's narrative is informed by his longtime direct experience with and study of European colonialism in Africa and elsewhere, and especially also Palestine. He recognizes colonialism when he sees it, and he sees it in the United States, which most US historians do not at all, nor does the left activists in the United States. The US historians and the population in general, the liberal population of the United States, see a provincial logic of the US system as either rational and had to be the way it was, or cruel and tragic, but not as colonialism. So in tracing the federal government's destruction of the independent status supposedly granted to the 5 large and prosperous native agricultural nations that were forced to move from the east of the Mississippi to what is now or what the US had designated as Indian Territory, which became Oklahoma, where I'm from. Mamdani notes the familiar colonial rhetoric of the federal government's investigation and report on supposed failures of those governments and why they were to be dissolved. The government report that led to the forced allotment and dissolving of the autonomous Native governments charged that these tribal governments have wholly perverted their high trusts. They have demonstrated the incapacity to govern themselves. The report dismisses the economic development successes of the Native nations of the Indian Territory as having been influenced and corrupted by white interlopers and mixed blood individuals, not the real Indians. I co-published a book a few years ago called All the Real Indians Died Off, and 20 other myths about Native Americans. Mamdani writes, here the commission was implementing a logic that became central to the indirect rule the world over, distinguishing the true native from the supposed interlopers. By claiming to protect the true native, colonial powers introduced distinctions that prevented solidarity among the colonized and justified the supervision of clusters of natives as discrete groups potentially engaged in rivalry with each other. And the colonial state was to be the neutral arbiter. Mamdani correctly observes that the struggle to grasp the contemporary relevance of the Indian question is embedded in the United States autobiography. He writes, this is not one story, of course. It is the work of generations of intellectuals across disciplines and ideological persuasions. These thinkers and writers include citizens and foreign observers. They are leftists, feminists, and anti-racists, as well as nationalists and enthusiasts of genocide. Collectively, they offer narratives about what it means to be an American. In none of the major or minor narratives does being an American mean being a colonizer. And Mamdani says the requirement for decolonization is for Americans to recognize that they live not in the first new nation, but the first settler colony. So neither settler nor native is a powerful work that allows no escape routes from the truth. I would like to hear more from Professor Mamdani about his proposed ideas for decolonization, which I haven't discussed here. In the United States, it seems to me that statehood, which is one of the ideas, would maintain the very colonizing structure that exists and is actually a possibility. But I believe that the total deconstruction of the US colonialist state is a prerequisite for Native survival, if not for all humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that, Roxanne. And now we have formally about another 20-25 minutes, more or less. Mahmoud, I will offer you 5 minutes or so to respond directly to some of what the panelists have raised. I may have a question, the panelists may have some further questions to you, but we do want to give time for Q&A from our audience. Mahmoud, it's in your hands. You're muted.
Thank you, David, and a big thank you to panelists. Obviously, given the time constraint, I cannot respond to each person in detail. But what I would like to do is to take what I think are 5 key issues and to respond these without tagging any names to the issues. First of all, I think I should put it right out there in front that mine is not an effort to provide a blueprint. I'm not a conventional political theorist. And as I understand, the conventional political theorist spends a lifetime thinking of how to define the good society. I am more interested in an analytical pursuit, more interested in how those of us who live in the world reflect on this world, and more interested in the, as opposed to what we wish it to be, okay, how we reflect on it and how we act on it, and the different paths that we take in the process. So I resist putting forward a wish list. Although, of course, as is clear from the comments, I do not entirely succeed in doing so. So, for example, what does decolonization mean? What would decolonization of the US mean? And I do talk about you know, what would it mean to decolonize the reservation? To give the reservation or reservations the same status as states in the US, to give them representation within Congress, to take them away from you know, congressional dictatorship, kind of, to take them away from wardship, all of these. But I would just say that these are ideas thrown out there for precisely the kind of discussion that is emerging. My major object is not a blueprint. My aim is also not to flatten diversity and to provide a single answer. Because again, I do not seek to discount context. I do want to illuminate different paths. My object is not to negate politics. It is not to say that Israel is a mirror image of the US. It's just a replication of the US in another setting. No, the settlers in the US never claimed to be natives, and the settlers in Israel do claim to be natives, natives returning home. And when they look at the Palestinians, they see them, in my view, as more or less as squatters. They see them very much not like the European settlers in America, but they see them more like the liberated African Americans who went to Africa and set up Liberia, and who saw the natives who never left Africa as an uncivilized bunch which needed to be civilized, as squatters, in a sense, who were incapable of development. On the question of political decolonization, I acknowledge those on the African continent and elsewhere who have talked of the need to create federations, etc. But my main point is really that there is no qualitative difference in how they have thought of political decolonization. The emphasis has always been on the outside, on increasing the unit, expanding the unit of the state. There has been very little attempt to look at the inside, to look at the kind of political boundaries and kind of political communities created by colonial power on the inside, the ways in which difference has been politicized. This is much more my concern. Now, I do recognize and I would accept that the federation is a very interesting question because it's federation in the US, for example, the Civil War and post-Civil War, what was there before and what was created after the Civil War. Before the Civil War, sort of seeing the US as kind of a mirror image of Europe, where each state, the notion of a confederation, where each state was more or less supposed to be independent. And then the creation of, where each state had its own citizenship, and the creation of a federal unit after the Civil War, where citizenship was not state-based, but was based, the country as a whole, where it was based on residence rather than descent and birth, etc. So I don't study that experience in this book, but it's an experience worth studying. What were the gains and what were the limits of federation? Finally, the question of violence. I mean, am I saying that we should just think of violence? First of all, I'm talking of not all violence. I'm talking of extreme violence, okay? And I'm not discounting criminal culpability for violence, but I'm saying that to understand extreme violence as the outcome of a political project is critical, because the political trumps the criminal. And I have two cases. I have the two cases of extreme violence, Nuremberg and apartheid South Africa. And in the case of Nuremberg, we have 1 million+ individuals being tried for crimes, and we have no mention of Nazism as a political project. So at the end of Nuremberg, the Jewish people still have no place in Europe, because Europe remains a collection of nation states and Jews remain outside of it. The only home Europe will support for Jews is a home outside Europe. South Africa is very different, because South Africa, CODESA is about thinking of a new political project. In spite of all the killings which are well known, like the killing of Biko, Steve Biko, there is no court trial, none whatsoever. There is an attempt to move away from the notion that you just have a winner or a loser, like in a court case. There is an attempt to move to forming a new political community, a political community of survivors. Now, I want to make one thing clear. I'm not talking about social justice, and I'm not claiming that there has been any social justice in South Africa. In fact, I accept that there hasn't been, but my argument is simply that the political comes prior to the social, that the creation of a political community of survivors, of all those who survived, not survivor in the sense of Holocaust literature, but all those who survived the catastrophe, not survivor as in Rwanda, but all those who have survived the catastrophe, whether victim or perpetrator, whether bystander or beneficiary, all remain members of the political community. Then comes the question of social justice. David, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very, very much, Mahmoud. My intention had been to raise a question myself and to turn it back to the panelists for 1 or 2 questions. But I do want to give our larger audience an opportunity to put questions to you, Mahmoud. And so if the panelists will forgive me, Mahmoud, I will read these. There are at the moment 4 questions from the audience, and I will read them, or as many as I can. And we can go over time a little bit. I don't know how much time Harlow will allow us, but let's see how much we can pack in. The first question, I believe it's okay for me. Is it okay for me to call the name of the person who is asking the question?
Yes,
I hope
Dr.
so. Okay. So the first question is from Asia Nakova, and the question is as follows, Mahmoud. How does the author see the economic aspect of the European colonial project in the US in the context of transition from feudalism to capitalism, and later on full establishment of capitalism. How does the author see the economic aspect of the European colonial project in the US?
Well, it's an invitation to write another book.
Yes.
The question is pointing out precisely what I did not write and did not, and was not really interested in, in writing this book. Because in writing this book, my interest is very much the political. The extent to which I concerned myself with the European economic interests or European interests in the US was in dealing with the notion of rights based on first discovery, etc., and how this was an attempt to prevent a violent clash between contending powers. But at the same time, of course, there were violent clashes between contending powers. Lincoln was deeply aware of the possibility of either the French and the Indians coming together or the Confederacy and the Indians coming together. This was part of what informed Lincoln's politics. I'm sure another part was the fact that he was an Indian hunter in his earlier life. But I really don't have much to say about European colonial project.
The second question from the audience is, I suspect one of your colleagues, Mahmoud, Jacob Katumusime. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the name, forgive me. And it's, I'm not sure. The question is about Ethiopia. And the question seems to be about whether your theoretical lens helps us to understand the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Jacob. Well, there's a scholarship around Ethiopia, a very strong mainstream scholarship, which I think can best be characterized as united by a single claim, which is Ethiopian exceptionalism. And the starting point of this claim is that Ethiopia was the only country in Africa which was not colonized. Well, it's not true. Ethiopia was colonized. It was colonized by Italy for 5 years. The only thing is it was not called colonization. It was called Italian settlement, just as Israeli colonization of the West Bank is not called colonization. It uses the language of the settlement. But Italian colonization borrowed much from British and French experiences around Africa. Italian colonization, in order to counter the Orthodox Church, began to woo Muslim communities to build mosques, to give preferential treatment to Amharic Muslims and non-Amharic Muslims. It is after Italy's withdrawal, 5 years later, that Haile Selassie began a program of Amharization of the state, a deep and strong Amharization of the state. And it is against that background that the EPRDF emerges with its program of ethnic federalism. And it is ethnic federalism which is then seen as a camouflage for basically Tigray dominance of the whole of Ethiopia, which is what lies behind Abiy's claim today. So, I mean, I'm not trying to give an easy and facile explanation. I'm not even trying to give this as an explanation, but I'm just trying to string together some of the dots just to say that, of course, the Italian experience has been important.
Thank you, Mahmoud. There are two more questions so far. The next question that I'm going to put from the Q&A is from Tule Hazelrig. Again, forgive me if I'm massacring the name. The American eugenics movement, the question goes, of the first half of the 20th century was a deeply racist movement based on faulty science. Did it have specific effects on the lives of Native Americans? The American eugenics movement.
Yeah. Yes, it did. Within limits of what I've studied and I've read. The introduction of racist thought, racist categories, racist distinctions in the governance of American Indians comes from this period. The notion of full blood, half blood Indians, the idea that the negation of the notion that you can be assimilated into an Indian tribe because you are culturally assimilated, even if you may not have any significant or any Indian lineage, in a sense, that has been negated. So it's now the definition of who is an Indian is basically very race-based, very blood-based. That's what I would say. I realize, David, that of course, none of those who are asking questions have had an opportunity to read the book because we're holding this one day after the book came out. So there is something.
Alas. So there are a couple more questions here, and since we have a little bit of time, so the next question is from David Shimba. I have two questions. In tracing the origin and the development of the nation state to the establishment of the Spanish state, and particularly the 1492 deportations of Jews and Moors, don't we miss out the antecedents to this Spanish state, the Moorish invasion of Iberia, for instance, as also part of the very origin of the modern nation state? Two, it seems to me that if criminal justice explains away the political in the expression of violence, survivor's justice does seem to explain away victims' claims, including truth-seeking, apology, reparation, whatever the form and content. How best should survivors' justice remain accountable to past evil?
Great questions. Yeah, of course. There's no event without a past, right? There is none which just stand on its own, and there's none which is just the starting point of time. So the question is where to draw the line. The Iberian invasion, I mean, we're talking of 700 years before. You know, it's a long history. It's a long history, and it is much more of a history of assimilation and even aggressive assimilation, as opposed to a history of ethnic cleansing, segregation. Now, I will not deny that there must be resonances, whether these are in terms of what was incorporated or they are in terms of what was rejected. But I begin with 1492 as a project defined by ethnic cleansing, as a project defined by building a nation which is one nation, one religion, one empire. So, yeah, there may be something fruitful there, and it's not what I worked on. Survivors' justice and victims' justice. Well, victims' justice has been the banner ever since Nuremberg. It's the banner with the International Criminal Court. It's the banner with all the courts, whether in Rwanda or Yugoslavia or Cambodia. And victims' justice has turned out to be the flip side of victor's justice. The victor has defined victims' justice. The victor has set up courts to try perpetrators. But whether at Nuremberg or in the International Criminal Court, only the losers are tried. Winners are never tried. And victims' justice has also ended up fueling a cycle of violence. And I think if we look at the history of violence, we begin to realize that quite often victims and perpetrators trade places. There is no permanent victim and there's no permanent perpetrator. And violence poses a challenge, which is how do you terminate the violence? How do you bring the violence to an end? How do you ensure that those who have suffered injustice dressed up as justice today, or an injury dressed up as justice, do not turn around tomorrow to then demand redress and begin a new round of violence. And my claim basically is that most violence is a result of exclusion. It is a result of exclusion which is either ethnic or racial. And that violence points us to the kind of reform of the political community that is needed and necessary. Violence, that reform will not stop all violence. There will be new kinds of violence, but I do not claim that this is a project to end all violence. Far from it. But violence is how we got here. The criminal paradigm sees all violence as somehow irrational. And sees the possibility of doing away with violence. The criminal paradigm never addresses state violence because crime by definition is violence against the state. The criminal paradigm exalts state violence if anything else. And my purpose is the opposite in a way. My purpose is to bring the state and the political character of the state under examination, and to think of how we may move to effect reforms which would address the question of exclusion.
We have time for at least one more question for you, and it's from Howard Taylor, who I suspect we might know. Thank you for this fantastic book. I'm interested in the extent to which the book traces the template for most, if not all, settler and racial violence to the United States. For example, when analyzing the Shoah and its political and legal afterlives, the book does not mention the scholarship on the connections between National Socialism and German colonialism in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. What do you see as the political stakes of positioning the US markedly as the origin rather than arguing for multiple origins?
Thank you, Howard. I've not had the good fortune of meeting or knowing Howard. but the good fortune of a question here. I don't think I would stake my claim on a single origin as opposed to multiple origins. And anyway, the section on Nazi Germany and Hitler is really drawn from secondary sources. It's drawn from the Yale professor Whitman, his book on Nazism in America, and particularly his research on when the Nazis began to create Nuremberg laws, race laws. They set up a committee to study American citizenship laws. And this committee was so taken in by the fact that the US had differentiated citizenship, that some citizens had full rights, other category of citizens didn't have full rights, had less rights. And ultimately, when they came to the one-drop rule with African Americans, they were totally disgusted that this was too much. Germany could not go by this. So, first answer to your question is yeah, I am investigating. I'm looking at somebody who has investigated one origin of one part of the Nazi legacy. And of course, you're also right. There is a relationship between Nazism and German colonialism, especially in the African case. If you come to Southwest, what is called Namibia now, in Southwest Africa, the first genocide of the century was a German genocide in Namibia. And a lot of the medical experiments and some of the doctors who came out of that went into the Nazi fold and continued their experiments under the Nazi fold.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. I'm getting a signal that we should begin to wrap this up, but can I ask whether the panelists have any further questions that they would like to put to Mahmoud? I will give you an opportunity. Very short, sharp questions. Roxanne?
I have one. Mahmoud, you said that settlers in the United States didn't think of themselves as natives, but actually they did self-indigenize. They in my book, I go through the way that happened, and there are groups of people like Appalachians who to this day consider themselves indigenous to the Appalachia. The Cherokee people were ethnically cleansed from there. So they see as it was handed over to them as indigenous peoples. This was in the last of the Mohegan, handing over indigeneity to the settler. And many, like Irish Americans, the Catholic Church, they have this, the idea that the discovery of the United States, that this made the first settlers indigenous, and that this came before Columbus. So it's actually, the book I'm writing now on Not a Nation of Immigrants. I've researched this really deeply, and it's more even than I had imagined. So that's just, I don't know if you have a response to that, but I see it more like a corrective rather than a question. Thanks.
Mahmoud, very quickly.
Sorry.
very quickly.
Yeah, I acknowledge that entirely. That there is a politics within the settler community, and that politics uses the language of native exclusively within the settler community to refer to the first set of arrivals from Europe. And that's, well, it's very potent in today's debate on what's called immigration, today's immigration debate. It was very potent in American politics, late 19th, early 20th century. The natives who had nothing to do with Indians, but had to do with the early European settlers as opposed to late arrivals. And always an attempt to hold the line in terms of new arrivals of settlers.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mahmoud. And I think on that note, we should bring this occasion to a close. So let me thank Roxanne, Nadia, Mamadou for their wonderful and insightful comments. I would like to thank the audience for their stimulating questions. I'm very, very sorry that we didn't have time for all of the questions. Perhaps you can engage Mahmoud directly with these questions. And thank you, Mahmoud, for another obviously very stimulating book. Thanks, everyone. And
thank you. And thank you, Mahmoud. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, David. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, David.